Some prayers should never be answered. Dr. Rebecca Mitchell learned this truth on a night when the walls between life and death grew dangerously thin. What she witnessed in room 237 would shatter everything she believed about medicine, faith, and the price of salvation. It was 3:17 in the morning when the call came through. St. Catherine's Hospital stood silent except for the mechanical breathing of ventilators and the distant hum of fluorescent lights. Rebecca had been working the graveyard shift for 6 years, long enough to recognize the rhythm of death approaching. But nothing in her training prepared her for what walked through those emergency doors. The patient arrived without a name, no identification, no medical history. Just a man in his late 30s, unconscious, his body bearing no visible injuries, yet teetering on the edge of something Rebecca couldn't diagnose. His vital signs made no sense. Heart rate erratic, dropping to flatline, then surging back as if something kept pulling him between worlds. The nurses whispered among themselves, crossing themselves when they thought no one was watching. Rebecca dismissed their superstition. She was a woman of science trained at Johns Hopkins, dedicated to logic and evidence. The supernatural had no place in her sterile world of diagnoses and treatment plans. Yet as she stood over this nameless patient, her stethoscope pressed against his chest, she heard something that defied explanation. Not a heartbeat. Not exactly. It sounded like whispers. Dozens of voices speaking in unison, too faint to understand, but impossible to ignore. She pulled back, checking her equipment. Faulty stethoscope. Had to be. But when she tried again, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be calling a name. Calling her name. Room 237 became her obsession. She checked on him every hour, then every 30 minutes, then she simply stopped leaving. The other staff avoided the room. Nurse Patricia, who had worked at St. Catherine's for 23 years, refused to enter after the first night. She claimed the temperature dropped 10 degrees whenever she approached the door, claimed she saw shadows moving across the walls when no one was there. Rebecca documented none of this in the official charts. How could she? What diagnosis code existed for supernatural dread? The patient remained unconscious, trapped in whatever space existed between awareness and oblivion. His body showed no signs of improvement, yet he didn't deteriorate either. He simply existed in suspension as if waiting for something, or someone. Rebecca ran every test modern medicine could offer. Blood work revealed nothing abnormal. Brain scans showed activity, but in patterns she had never encountered. It was as if his consciousness was present, but operating on a frequency beyond standard measurement. On the third night, Rebecca fell asleep in the chair beside his bed. Exhaustion had finally claimed her after 72 hours of continuous observation. That's when the dreams began. Or were they dreams? She found herself walking through corridors that resembled St. Catherine's, but stretched impossibly long. Doors opened into rooms that shouldn't exist. In each room, a patient. In each patient, a story of suffering, loneliness, and desperate prayers whispered into the darkness of night. She saw a woman dying of cancer, begging for one more day with her daughter. A man whose heart was failing, pleading for forgiveness from a brother he had wronged. A child with an illness no treatment could touch, asking why God had abandoned her. Room after room, soul after soul, each trapped in their own private purgatory of pain and hope, intertwined. Then she reached room 237. But in this dream version, the patient was awake. His eyes were open and they held the weight of centuries. When he spoke, his voice carried the echo of all those desperate prayers she had witnessed. He asked her a question that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Rebecca woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was freezing. Her breath formed clouds in the air. The machines around the bed were all functioning normally, but the patient's monitors showed something that stopped her cold. His brain activity had spiked, not randomly. It had spiked at the exact moment she woke up, as if he had been there, in her dream, waiting for her. She reached for her phone to call for assistance, but her hand froze. The patient's fingers had moved, just barely, just enough to be noticed. They were tracing something on the bedsheet. A pattern. No, not a pattern. Letters. He was writing something over and over, even though his eyes remained closed and his body showed no other signs of consciousness. Rebecca leaned closer, trying to decipher the message his fingers were desperately inscribing. The temperature dropped further, the lights flickered, and in that moment of darkness and returning light, she saw what he had been writing. 3 words, repeated endlessly across the fabric. 3 words that made her blood run ice cold. She stumbled backward, her scientific mind rebelling against what her eyes clearly saw. This wasn't possible. It violated every principle of medicine, logic, and natural law. Yet there it was, undeniable and terrifying in its implications. The patient's lips moved then, just slightly. No sound emerged, but Rebecca could read the shape his mouth formed, the same 3 words his fingers had traced. And those words were a name, not his name, hers. Her full name, including the middle name she never used, the name only her deceased mother had called her. Rebecca's voice came out as barely a whisper, shaking with a terror she had never known before. She looked at this impossible patient, this nameless man who somehow knew her most private identity, and asked the question that would change everything. "Who are you?" The silence that followed her question felt alive. Rebecca stood frozen in room 237, waiting for an answer that didn't come. The patient's eyes remained closed, his breathing shallow but steady. The machines returned to their rhythmic beeping, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, but Rebecca's hands were still trembling. The name traced on the bedsheet was already fading, smoothed away by time or something less explainable. She stepped into the hallway, needing distance from whatever presence filled that room. St. Catherine's Hospital at 4 in the morning was a cathedral of suffering. The long corridors stretched in both directions, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that never truly banished the shadows. This place had stood for 90 years, built on land that local historians claimed was once a cemetery for the unnamed poor. Rebecca had always dismissed such stories as folklore meant to add drama to an otherwise ordinary medical facility. Now she wasn't certain of anything. The night shift staff moved like ghosts themselves, exhausted souls performing their duties through muscle memory and dedication. Rebecca watched Nurse Patricia emerge from room 241, where an elderly man named Joseph Crawford had been dying slowly for 3 weeks. His family visited less frequently now, their hope eroded by the grinding reality of terminal illness. Patricia's face carried the particular weariness that comes from witnessing too much death, from holding too many hands as the light fades from human eyes. Rebecca approached her colleague, keeping her voice low. She needed to know if anyone else had experienced the unexplainable around their mysterious patient. Patricia's reaction was immediate and visceral. Her eyes widened, and she glanced toward room 237 as if afraid it might hear them speaking. She pulled Rebecca into the medication room, closing the door behind them. What Patricia revealed made Rebecca's scientific worldview crack further. The patient had been brought in by ambulance, but when Patricia called the dispatch center to get the paramedic report, they had no record of the call. No ambulance had been sent to any location that night. She had spoken to the driver, seen the vehicle with her own eyes, yet according to official records, it never existed. The paramedics themselves had vanished. No one could locate them, and security footage from the emergency entrance showed the patient simply appearing on the gurney. One frame showed an empty bay. The next frame showed him there, as if materialized from nothing. Patricia's voice dropped to a whisper. She had seen this before, she claimed. 12 years ago, a patient arrived under similar circumstances. No name, no identification, no explanation for their presence. That patient had remained in a coma for 7 days, whispering words in languages the staff couldn't identify. On the 7th night, everyone who entered their room experienced vivid dreams of their deepest regrets and darkest secrets. On the 8th morning, the patient was gone, not deceased, not transferred, simply absent, with no trace they had ever existed except for the memories of those who had cared for them. Rebecca wanted to dismiss this as hospital legend, the kind of ghost story medical staff tell to break the monotony of night shifts. But the fear in Patricia's eyes was genuine, and it mirrored the dread growing in Rebecca's own chest. She returned to room 237, driven by a compulsion she couldn't name. As a doctor, she had a duty to her patient, As a human being, every instinct screamed at her to run. The patient looked different somehow, though Rebecca couldn't identify what had changed. His face held the same features, yet something in his expression had shifted. Even unconscious, he seemed to be listening, waiting, gathering information from the world around him through means beyond the five senses medicine acknowledged. Rebecca began documenting everything in a private journal, separate from the official medical records. She noted the temperature fluctuations, the way electronic equipment malfunctioned in his presence, the dreams that plagued anyone who spent extended time near him. She recorded the whispers other staff members reported hearing, always in the early morning hours when darkness held its strongest grip on the world. By the fourth day, a pattern emerged. Each night, the patient's brain activity intensified at exactly 3:17, the same time he had arrived. During these episodes, staff throughout the hospital reported disturbances. Lights flickered in distant wings. Patients who had been stable suddenly coded, then recovered just as mysteriously. Call buttons activated in empty rooms. And always, the temperature in room 237 plummeted to near freezing, despite the heating system functioning perfectly everywhere else. Rebecca stopped going home. She showered in the staff facilities, grabbed a few hours of sleep in the on-call room, but always found herself drawn back to his bedside. Her colleagues noticed the change in her. Dr. Harrison, the chief of medicine, suggested she take personal leave. She declined. She couldn't leave. Not now. Not when she was beginning to understand that this patient wasn't here by accident or coincidence. On the fifth night, she discovered the truth about room 237 itself. While searching through old hospital records in the archives, she found construction documents from 1935, when this wing was built. The blueprints showed something that made her hands shake. Room 237 hadn't been designed as a patient room. It had been a chapel, a place where families could pray for their dying loved ones. It had been converted during renovations in 1978, after a series of incidents the records vaguely described as spiritual disturbances. She found testimonies from former staff members. They spoke of a presence in the chapel, something that seemed to collect prayers like a vessel collects water. Desperate prayers from desperate people, all their fear and hope and bargaining with powers beyond human understanding. The chapel had been sealed and repurposed because people claimed their prayers were being answered, but not in the ways they expected, not in ways that brought peace. Rebecca sat alone in the archive room, surrounded by decades of documentation, and felt the weight of realization settling over her. This patient, this nameless man between life and death, was connected to this room's history. He was part of something that had been growing here for 90 years, fed by the suffering and supplication of thousands of souls who had passed through these halls. Her phone buzzed, a text from the nursing station. The patient in room 237 was showing increased activity. They needed her immediately. Rebecca ran through the corridors, her footsteps echoing against tile floors. When she burst through the door, she found Patricia and two other nurses standing frozen, staring at the patient. His eyes were open, and he was looking directly at Rebecca. His eyes were not the eyes of a man waking from a coma. They held clarity, purpose, and something that transcended the biological function of sight. They were dark, impossibly deep, as if looking into them meant falling through layers of reality Rebecca had never known existed. The nurses backed toward the door, but Rebecca found herself stepping closer, drawn by a force that overrode her survival instincts. When he spoke, his voice came from everywhere and nowhere. It filled the room like water filling a vessel, surrounding them, pressing against their skin. He spoke her name again, the full name only her mother had used, and then he spoke other names, the names of every patient currently dying in St. Catherine's Hospital. Joseph Crawford in room 241, Maria Santos in the ICU, little Emma Chen in pediatrics, fighting leukemia that no treatment could defeat. He recited their names like a prayer, like a roll call of the condemned. Rebecca's medical training screamed that this was impossible. Coma patients don't wake with full awareness of their surroundings, don't possess knowledge they couldn't have acquired. But this wasn't a medical phenomenon. This was something else entirely, something that medicine had no vocabulary to describe. He sat up slowly and none of the monitoring equipment reacted. The leads attached to his chest should have registered movement, change in position, elevated heart rate. Instead, the machines showed flatline, as if they were connected to a corpse. Patricia fled the room, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. The other nurses followed, leaving Rebecca alone with this impossible being who wore human skin but contained something far older. He told her why he was here. His words came slowly, each sentence a revelation that shattered another piece of Rebecca's understanding of the world. He was an answer, not the answer to a single prayer, but to thousands of prayers spoken in desperation within these walls over 9 decades. Every plea for mercy, every bargain offered to God or fate or the universe, every promise made by someone watching a loved one slip away. Those prayers had accumulated, had gained weight and substance, had called something into existence. He was what happens when enough people beg for miracles in the same place. He was the manifestation of collective desperation, given form and purpose by the sheer volume of human suffering concentrated in this hospital. But miracles, he explained, require payment. The universe demands balance. Every life saved must be weighed against something of equal value. Rebecca's legs felt weak. She gripped the bedrail for support, her mind racing through implications she didn't want to accept. She asked the question that terrified her most. What payment? What did these miracles cost? His answer came not in words, but in visions. He touched her hand, and Rebecca saw. She witnessed moments scattered across the hospital's history. A mother whose dying child was inexplicably cured overnight, only to lose her husband in a car accident the next day. A man whose heart failure reversed itself miraculously, while his sister across the city suffered a stroke. A young woman who survived impossible odds, waking to learn her father had taken his own life the night before. Pattern after pattern of salvation purchased with unexpected tragedy, miracles paid for in blood and grief. The prayers had consequences. The desperate bargains people made in the darkest hours were being collected, enforced by something that existed beyond mercy or cruelty. It simply maintained balance, indifferent to human concepts of fairness or justice. Rebecca pulled her hand away, horror flooding through her. She understood now why he knew her name, why he had been waiting for her specifically. 3 months ago, her younger sister Emily had been in a car accident. The injuries were catastrophic. Doctors at another hospital gave her less than 5% chance of survival. Rebecca had sat in that waiting room, and she had prayed. She, who never believed in anything beyond science and medicine, had whispered desperate words into the universe, offering anything, everything, if her sister could live. Emily had survived. Against all medical probability, she had recovered fully. Rebecca had attributed it to skilled surgeons and luck, but there was no luck. There were only bargains made and debts coming due. The patient smiled then, and it was the saddest expression Rebecca had ever witnessed. He explained that he didn't choose who paid for whose miracles. The universe selected based on proximity, connection, threads of relationship invisible to human perception. Rebecca's prayer had saved Emily, but someone else's prayer, someone in this very hospital, had marked Rebecca as payment. She felt the world tilting beneath her feet. Somewhere in these halls, someone was praying for a miracle. And when that miracle came, Rebecca would be the cost. Her life, her future, everything she was would be sacrificed to balance the equation her own prayer had set in motion. She wanted to rage against the injustice of it. She wanted to argue that she hadn't understood what she was doing, that the prayer was meaningless words spoken in grief and fear. But looking into those ancient eyes, she knew argument was futile. The mechanism was already in motion, had been in motion since the moment Emily opened her eyes. Rebecca asked the only question that mattered. When? When would this debt be collected? He stood from the bed, his hospital gown hanging loose on his frame. The monitors continued to show flatline, continued to insist he was already dead. He walked to the window, looking out over the city lights, and told her she had until sunrise. 5 hours to make peace with her existence, to say goodbyes she couldn't explain, to prepare for an end she couldn't prevent, unless. He turned back to face her, and in his expression she saw something that might have been compassion or might have been curiosity. There was one way to break the cycle. One way to refuse payment without destroying the balance. She could take his place. Rebecca stared at him, trying to comprehend what he was offering. Take his place as what? As the collector of debts? As the manifestation of answered prayers and their terrible costs? The idea was insane, impossible, yet she found herself considering it. If her death was inevitable, perhaps she could transform it into something with purpose, something that might eventually break this cycle of suffering. But before she could respond, the door burst open. Patricia stood in the doorway, breathing hard, her face pale with urgency. Behind her, Dr. Harrison and 2 security guards entered the room. Harrison's expression was a mixture of concern and frustration as he looked from Rebecca to the patient who should have been comatose, but was standing by the window. Harrison spoke with careful authority, the voice of someone trying to de-escalate a crisis. He told Rebecca she needed to step away from the patient, that she had been working too many hours, that exhaustion was causing her to see things that weren't there. The patient wasn't standing. He was still in the bed, still unconscious, still in the same position he had been for 5 days. Rebecca turned to look at the window where the patient had been standing. The space was empty. She spun back toward the bed, and there he was, lying motionless, eyes closed, monitors showing the same erratic patterns they had displayed since his arrival. Harrison approached her gently, placing a hand on her shoulder, speaking in the calm tones doctors use with people experiencing psychological breaks. Everything she had just witnessed, the conversation, the visions, the revelation about prayers and payment, had it all been hallucination? Had the stress and sleep deprivation fractured her grip on reality? Patricia was explaining that she had been watching through the door camera, had seen Rebecca standing alone in the room, talking to herself, responding to questions no one was asking. The security footage would confirm it. Rebecca had been alone the entire time. They escorted her from room 237, their touches gentle but firm. Harrison insisted she go home, get real sleep in her own bed, take a few days away from the hospital. He would arrange for a colleague to cover her shifts. She was too valuable to lose to burnout. Patricia squeezed her hand with sympathy, whispering that everyone reaches a breaking point eventually, that there was no shame in needing rest. Rebecca allowed herself to be led away, her mind spinning with doubt and confusion. Maybe they were right. Maybe the isolation and exhaustion had created an elaborate delusion. She had been working 70-hour weeks for months, had been under enormous stress since Emily's accident. The human brain was capable of generating incredibly vivid hallucinations under such conditions. It was medically documented, scientifically explainable. She gathered her belongings from her locker, changed into street clothes, walked through the hospital corridors toward the exit. Dawn was approaching. Through the windows she could see the sky beginning to lighten at the edges, stars fading into the approaching day. She had survived until sunrise. If any of it had been real, she should be dead, or transformed, or whatever fate the patient had predicted. But she was simply tired, embarrassed, walking toward her car in the employee parking lot. Rebecca sat behind the wheel, keys in her hand, and allowed herself to feel relief. It had been a psychological episode. Frightening but explainable. She would take the time off, Harrison suggested, see a therapist, get her mental health back on track. She started the engine. Her phone rang. Emily's number. Rebecca answered, expecting her sister's cheerful morning greeting. Instead, she heard sobbing, incoherent words choked by grief. Emily was at the hospital, their hospital, St. Catherine's. She had been brought in an hour ago after collapsing at home. The doctors were running tests, but it looked like a brain aneurysm, massive and inoperable. Emily was dying. The keys fell from Rebecca's hand, the relief shattered like glass. She ran back toward the hospital entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs. This couldn't be happening. Emily had been fine, completely healthy since her recovery. There was no medical reason for an aneurysm, no warning signs, no genetic predisposition. Unless the miracle that saved Emily 3 months ago had never been permanent. Unless Rebecca's prayer had only borrowed time, and now the debt was being collected from the one person she had prayed to save. The cruelty of it took her breath away. She had offered anything to save her sister, and the universe was taking her sister as payment for her own survival. Rebecca burst through the emergency department doors, demanding to know where Emily was. pushing past staff who tried to slow her down. She found her sister in Trauma Bay 3, surrounded by medical equipment, doctors working frantically to stabilize her. Emily's eyes were open, confused and terrified, and when she saw Rebecca, she reached out her hand. Rebecca took it, feeling the weakness in her sister's grip, and in that moment of contact, she understood. Everything she had been told in room 237 was true, but she had misunderstood one critical detail. She wasn't the payment for someone else's miracle. Emily was the payment for hers. Rebecca's prayer hadn't saved Emily. It had saved Rebecca herself from something she didn't even know was coming, and Emily's recovery had been the cost, a loan that was now being called due. The patient's words echoed in her memory, but with new meaning. He had never said Rebecca would die at sunrise. He said the debt would be collected. He said she had until sunrise to say goodbye. She had heard what her guilt expected to hear, not what he actually revealed. Rebecca looked up at the clock. 6:23 in the morning. The sun was rising, and her sister, the only person she loved more than her own life, was dying because Rebecca had survived something she never knew threatened her. The patient in room 237 hadn't offered her a choice to save herself. He had offered her a choice to save Emily by taking his place as the collector, becoming the manifestation of prayer's dark side, existing between life and death for eternity. She ran back through the corridors, ignoring the shouts of staff behind her. She burst into room 237, and he was awake again, sitting up, waiting for her return. He had known she would come back, had known that understanding the truth would bring her here, desperate and willing. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She spoke the words he needed to hear, accepted the bargain he had offered, agreed to take his place. Anything to save Emily, anything to undo the cascade her prayer had created. He smiled, and this time there was relief in his expression. Relief and freedom. He told her the truth she should have seen from the beginning. He wasn't a manifestation of prayers. He was the first person who made this bargain 90 years ago when this room was still a chapel. He had traded his existence to save someone he loved, and he had been trapped here ever since, bound to this place, forced to witness and facilitate the terrible mathematics of miracles. He had been waiting for someone desperate enough and loving enough to take his place, waiting for someone like Rebecca. The transfer happened instantly. Rebecca felt her body become lighter and heavier simultaneously, felt her consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of flesh and bone, felt herself becoming anchored to room 237 and everything it represented. She watched as the patient, free at last from his 9-decade prison, walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold, looked back at her with pity and gratitude, and told her what she had just condemned herself to. She would exist here until someone else accepted the bargain. Decades, perhaps centuries, trapped between life and death, watching prayers be answered and costs be collected, powerless to intervene or warn or change the mechanism she was now part of. She would become the warning that no one would believe, the nightmare that doctors would dismiss as hallucination, the ghost story nurses would tell on night shifts. He walked through the door and disappeared, truly gone for the first time since 1935. Rebecca tried to follow, but found she couldn't cross the threshold. Room 237 was her world now, her prison, her eternal responsibility. She turned back to see her own body lying in the hospital bed, comatose, taking the place the patient had occupied. The monitors showed flatline even though she could see her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Through the walls, she felt Emily's life force stabilize, strengthen, return from the edge of death. The doctors would call it a miracle. They would have no explanation for her sudden recovery. And somewhere in this hospital, someone who had been praying desperately would find their prayer answered. And somewhere else, someone would begin to pay the price. Rebecca understood now. The real horror wasn't death or sacrifice. It was eternal awareness of suffering without the power to end it. She had become the answer to prayers, and she would witness the consequences forever. Time moves differently when you exist between worlds. Rebecca discovered this truth in the hours that followed her transformation. Minutes stretched into eternities, while years compressed into moments. She remained bound to room 237, a consciousness without freedom, a witness without agency, forever tethered to the mechanism of miracles and their costs. She watched Emily recover fully, watched her sister leave the hospital with no memory of how close she had come to death. The doctors documented it as spontaneous resolution, a medical anomaly they couldn't explain but gladly accepted. Emily would go on to live a full life, never knowing that her sister had traded everything to make that life possible. Rebecca found some comfort in that ignorance. Love, she understood now, often requires sacrifice that must remain unspoken and unrecognized. The hospital continued its rhythm around her. Patients arrived, suffering and hoping in equal measure. Some prayed in desperation, their words feeding into the mechanism Rebecca had become part of. She felt each prayer like a weight added to a scale, felt the universe calculating what balance would require. She couldn't stop the process, couldn't warn those who whispered their desperate bargains into the darkness. She could only watch as prayers were answered and payments were extracted. Dr. Harrison visited her body regularly during the first months. He sat beside the bed, talking to her comatose form about hospital developments, sharing his frustration at losing such a talented physician to what he assumed was a severe psychiatric break. He blamed himself for not recognizing the signs of her deterioration earlier. Patricia came too, holding Rebecca's hand, praying for her recovery. Those prayers hurt the most, knowing they might be answered, but at a cost Patricia would never anticipate. Rebecca tried to reach them, tried to communicate through the veil that separated her existence from theirs. Sometimes she succeeded in small ways. Lights would flicker when Harrison spoke about giving up hope. The temperature would drop when Patricia prayed, but these manifestations were too subtle, too easily dismissed as electrical problems or faulty heating systems. She was doomed to remain a ghost story, a cautionary tale about doctors who work too hard and break under pressure. Months became years. Her body remained in room 237, maintained by feeding tubes and medical intervention, a comatose patient with no hope of recovery, but stable enough that the hospital couldn't ethically withdraw care. New staff arrived who knew her only as the doctor in room 237, the sad case of brilliant potential, destroyed by mental illness. They used her as an example in training, warning young residents about the importance of self-care and recognizing burnout. But Rebecca's consciousness expanded in ways that transcended her physical imprisonment. She began to perceive the threads that connected prayers to consequences, began to understand the vast web of cause and effect that most humans never see. She witnessed how a father's prayer for his son's survival resulted in a stranger's car accident 3 states away. She saw how a woman's desperate plea for financial salvation led to her brother's unexpected job loss. The mechanism didn't distinguish between deserving and undeserving, between just and unjust. It simply maintained balance with mathematical precision. The horror of this knowledge was that she recognized its necessity. The universe couldn't grant infinite miracles without cost. Prayer wasn't a magical solution, but a bargain with reality itself, and reality always demanded payment. What humans called faith was actually a transaction, and most people who prayed never realized they were signing contracts written in the suffering of others. Rebecca came to understand why the previous prisoner of room 237 had seemed so sad, so weary, witnessing endless cycles of hope and despair, seeing prayers answered only to create new tragedies. Knowing the truth about faith's terrible price, it eroded whatever remained of your belief in mercy or justice or divine compassion. There was only mechanism, only balance, only the eternal equation that couldn't be altered or escaped. Yet she also witnessed something that surprised her. Some prayers were never answered. Some people prayed with complete sincerity, offered everything they had and received nothing in return. At first she thought this was cruelty, but gradually she understood it was actually protection. The mechanism only responded to prayers spoken with certain intensity, certain desperation. It required complete willingness to sacrifice, even if the person praying didn't fully comprehend what they were offering. Those whose prayers went unanswered were those who, on some unconscious level, weren't willing to pay the price. The universe was protecting them from themselves. Rebecca wished she had been one of them, wished her prayer for Emily had been dismissed as insufficient. But she had meant every word, had been willing to trade anything, and the mechanism had responded accordingly. She had no one to blame but herself. Love had made her vulnerable, and vulnerability had made her a prisoner. Years passed, 20, 30, perhaps more. Rebecca lost count. Her body aged slowly in its comatose state, grey hair appearing, skin weathering, but remaining alive through medical intervention, and something else, something connected to her role as the collector. She couldn't die because the mechanism needed her consciousness as its anchor, its translator between human desperation and cosmic mathematics. New patients arrived in room 237 after periods when the hospital administration tried to use it for standard care. None stayed long, equipment malfunctioned. Patients reported nightmares and visions. Nurses refused assignments. Eventually, the room would return to holding only Rebecca, the permanent resident. The unnamed fear that kept staff away during night shifts. She wondered if she would be here forever, or if someday another person would arrive, desperate enough and loving enough to accept the bargain and take her place. She found herself both hoping for and dreading that possibility. Freedom would mean escape from this eternal witnessing, but it would also mean condemning another soul to the same imprisonment. Was her liberation worth another person's damnation? Perhaps that question had no answer. Perhaps it was simply another equation seeking balance, another prayer requiring payment, another turn of the wheel that ground human hope into cosmic dust. St. Catherine's Hospital continued standing, continued serving the sick and dying, continued being a place where desperate people whispered desperate prayers. And in room 237, Rebecca remained, the doctor who had wanted to save lives, discovering that salvation always requires sacrifice, that miracles are never free, and that the answer to prayer might be the most terrifying thing you could ever receive. She existed now as a warning no one could hear, a truth no one would believe, a presence felt but never understood, and she would remain until someone else made her mistake, until love drove another person to trade eternity for a moment of salvation. In the end, perhaps the real miracle was fear,